Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Australia-Brazil Alumni Leadership Conference, co-hosted by the Embassy of Australia in Brazil and the Australian National University. This is the last webinar in this series that brought world-leading specialists to talk to our Brazilian alumni. Before we start, I would like to begin the session acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, and pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. A Embaixada da Austrália no Brasil apresentou essa série de webinars 2020 em parceria com a Australian National University, que é a universidade número 1 da Austrália, de acordo com o ranking QS. Por 2 semanas, a ANU trouxe especialistas renomados mundialmente para apresentações que vão apoiar o seu desenvolvimento profissional. Esta é a 6ª e última, infelizmente, da série deste ano. Mas, como o Nick acabou de comentar, nós vamos nos encontrar novamente, provavelmente face to face. O meu nome é Ana Paula, and like you, I'm part of the Brazilian alumni community, a former student of the ANU. It's a pleasure to be the moderator of tonight's session. I'll just go through a few housekeeping rules. This webinar is being recorded and may be broadcast on ANU TV on YouTube. We encourage everyone's participation. Your cameras and microphones were muted on entry. However, if you would like to raise a question to our speakers, you can send it via the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, or you can raise your hand. You can use the raise your hand function on Zoom. We can unmute you and allow you to speak. Please use the chat function to comment. If you want to send questions, use the Q&A. After the panelists deliver their presentations, we will have an attendee to join us and to speak about their experience in Australia. And now I would like to invite Nick Johnson, Director of International Strategy and Partnerships of the ANU, to say a few words to us.
Obrigado, Ana Paula. Boa noite, Brazil. Bom dia, Canberra. My name is Nick Johnson. I am, as Ana Paula says, the Director of International Strategy and Partnership here at Australian National University. As I said a few minutes ago, I also had the privilege to serve as Australia's first education counsellor to Brazil a few years ago. And so it's really great to be able to tie both the Australian National University and Australian Embassy in Brazil together in this event. So this is the 6th forum of this program this year. Unfortunately, it's not face-to-face this year, so there will be no caipirinha after this forum, but I'm sure you can look after that yourself. If you're in Brazil, it's a bit too early in Canberra. Yeah, it's really great to see the Australian and Brazilian education relationship going from strength to strength. We had a really great experience a few years ago with the students that came under the Ciências Sem Fronteiras program, Science Without Borders, and that would provide us with a really good starting point to grow the relationship. At the ANU, we're really keen to work more closely with Brazil in the future. I was going to go there in April to run some seminars with some academics from the ANU, participate in some conferences. However, of course, that was cancelled, but I'm really, really keen to see if we can do that next year, and that will and hopefully start a really deepening of our relationship with not only Brazil, but Latin America. So thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed this seminar. So back to you, Ana Paula.
Thank you, Nick. Tonight's theme is When Women Lead, Views from Asia and the Pacific. Our speakers will discuss factors which shape power relations and the ways which women lead in formal and in informal positions. We have with us Professor Bina da Costa from the Corobo School of Asian Pacific Affairs at the ANU, who's the former UNICEF Senior Specialist, and Dr. Nicole Haley, Head of Department of Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University. If during the presentation you have any questions for our speakers, please send it via the Q&A function on your screen. We are going to start with Professor Bina da Costa. You are also the Associate Dean for Inclusion, Diversity and Equity at the university. Isn't it fantastic that institutions are looking at these matters? Finally, I would say, but how far are we from integrating diversity and equity in all aspects of our life, Professor?
Well, that's an important question. Thank you, Anna, for allowing me to come and speak, share my experiences here. Hello, everyone. Good evening and good morning from Canberra. So just to respond to Anna's question, I think it's important to recognize that we need to have diverse voices. We need to open up the platform to inclusive agenda. But also, you know, Sonia Alvarez, who is a very well-known feminist economist, an academic from Latin America, as she mentioned in terms of women's participation, that simply adding women is not enough. Genuine inclusion and genuine diversity also requires for us to have, you know, to open up the space to also think about uncomfortable conversations and also sensitive discussions, so debates, dialogues, and how to empower those voices to come forward. So I'll talk a little bit about that also in terms of my presentation, Anna.
Awesome, thank you. So if you would please, yes, we are eager to see what you have to tell us.
Anna, may I share my screen?
Yes, of course.
Here you go. Can you see this? I hope you can.
Yes, we can.
Okay, so I just, let me just turn on my 20 minutes timer. So, you know, whenever we are talking about women and politics and women's participation, we really rarely start there. In particularly my work in global politics and international relations, and like other kinds of discussion of women's role and experiences in war and conflicts, we've often highlighted actually the points of victimization and marginalization. So women's voices, the way we talked about it in academia, in many disciplines started with women's roles as victims. And as if simply by making them hyper visible in that way, we can talk about women. So this had been problematic, but this also offered us a lot of interesting entry points and opportunities to bring diverse voices of women, to think about women's different kinds of experiences. But when women lead, we sort of like change it the way we talk about women. Women are at the forefront of movements, and that's how feminists have globally talked about women's rights. Women talked about changing laws. Women talked about changing really oppressive systems, patriarchal rules and regulations. So you have images here, one from Afghanistan and the other one from Pakistan, the places where I have done a lot of work, where you see women coming forward in the street, despite having very conservative religious leaders actually also trying to push women's agenda at the back in the private sphere. So women have done that in the region where I do a lot of my work, particularly in South Asia, and also working at the moment in Southeast Asia. From UNICEF, where I served as a senior migration and displacement specialist, I also looked at the Syrian emergency and served in Italy, from where we looked at Europe's refugee emergency, and also in the Horn of Africa. So I'm happy to talk about that if you're interested later on during Q&A. But for my talk, I will particularly focus on my writings and expertise and teaching in South Asia. So when we also talk about women in global politics and international relations, intersectionality is an important issue where we connect race, class, caste, location, culture, all of those in terms of gender. But whenever we are talking about women's role in leadership, we have senior women, powerful women, one kind of women like Hillary Clinton, Condoleezza Rice. Then you have the South Asian leaders below, Sheikh Hasina from Bangladesh, Benazir Bhutto from Pakistan, who was assassinated, and Sonia Gandhi from India. You have one kind of women, and they are leading the other kind of women when we are talking about political participation. These other images and images from Afghanistan, from both in Jalalabad in 2015. So you have one kind of women trying to think about political participation of another kind of women, but then you have really vast power discrepancy. So one important question for us to think about in 2020 and going forward is that, do we need to think about a different kind of feminist leadership? Where and what does inclusive leadership look like? If we have one kind of women who break the glass ceiling, does it mean the other kind of women who are sweeping the glasses on the floor? So how do we actually think about bottom-up and top-down kind of political participation of women? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because I know that you're very much aware of it. But of course, gender is very much socially constructed and sex is biological. But what do we mean when we are thinking intellectually thinking about gender and how that changes women's leadership? So in my work, obviously, when I was writing and when I teach, I always try to talk about this idea and this kind of framing that, you know, women's leadership is also not homogeneous. The way women, we are not homogeneous globally from wherever we are thinking about issues of women. Our ideas and our theoretical understanding, our experience, intellectual traditions, they're also not homogeneous. We come from different kinds of background. We are products of our history, our culture, different languages. So we also have different issues with which we come forward in terms of leadership roles. Then in terms of also work, we also know that development, women's participation in development, particularly in the International Decade for Women that the UN introduced between 76 to 85, that really put women's leadership at the forefront of the development agenda. And women as leaders, as activists, as advocates of human rights, in security as well, they talked about in different ways. There were lots of debates. Women in development agenda, that adding women in development in NGOs, in empowerment discourse, then women and development agenda, which came from particularly from South Africa and also Asia and the Pacific, that how you include them. And then gender and development, so expanding the understanding. Then we talked about gender mainstreaming, gender budgeting, all these different ways we thought about women. And also very, very important, there is a women, environment and development agenda. So these are very crude ways of simplifying, I guess, women's leadership. But what it means is that the discussion from different disciplines, the discussion at global levels, regional level, and in very much national level was about economic insecurity, thinking about poverty, thinking about women's exclusion from the development agenda and practices, and thinking about how to make it more inclusive. So some of these I also look at in terms of South Asia. But this is also very much changed when you look at our region in South Asia, is that how do we include Southern women, women's voices from global South? So looking at issues of movements. So thinking about that leadership doesn't only mean participation at the top. Leadership can be very much bottom up. Leadership can be inclusive within the community. And sometimes you will have leaders who may not necessarily be wanting to stay at the front, but leading from behind. But what does some of this mean? This is very much important for us to think about. There's a very important organization, Development Alternatives for a New Era, DAWN, from Fiji, which I'm sure Nicole can talk much more about that than me, that talked about and championed the discussion of empowerment. So very much thinking about empowering and recognizing women's voices. And in politics, we also talk about emancipation that is championed by theorists like Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, who talked about freedom, thinking about the ideas of freedom from fear, then freedom from want. So not only thinking about poverty and other issues, but also thinking about fear, that how to actually make people, particularly women, also emancipated in that kind of space as well. So also in my research currently, and this I bring back from work in UNICEF, is looking at ideas of race, prejudice, xenophobia, how they actually intersect in the discussion of gender. So these I'm looking at in my very current research on forced migration. So what it means in terms of forced migration work is that you have also very vulnerable people in refugee, in settlements, in camps, and in displaced zones globally, and also in South Asia, large camps, for example, the Rohingya camp, you must have heard about them in Bangladesh. Then you have camps in Afghanistan, in Sri Lanka, you have, which are IDP camps. In Nepal, you have particular camps. So here, you cannot actually only think about gender strategies that focus on women, but really champion women's voices, really bringing them at the forefront, but thinking about gendered violence that also impact men and also impact boys, but actually also bringing men together in achieving gender equality. So some of these become really important in terms of our discussion of masculinities, thinking about patriarchal system that also operate in very vulnerable positions, particularly camps where everybody is extremely vulnerable. Then actually also bringing men into some of those discussions. So making men also partners in promoting women as leaders, as champions. So I'm going to skip through this, that these are some of the very, broadly speaking, when we're looking at women's leadership, we think about oppression, we are looking at rights, we are talking about sexual and reproductive rights. Then we think about public policy and international mechanisms, so inclusive agendas, women's role as leaders, and finally, women's role in social change, how we are looking at some of those issues in terms of development, race, and culture. These become really important in South Asia, and it's also very relevant, I know, for Brazil and other parts of the world. Excuse me. So very briefly, the other important piece of the puzzle linked to development and also linked to human rights is security. That a lot of times now when we're looking at leadership, we're trying to bring women at the forefront of leading and also including them in actually security sector. So you have images there from not only activism, but also from women's participation in Nepal, in Pakistan, and in Afghanistan. But in my research, what I've seen is that although you have UN agencies and a lot of member states of the UN who actively promote women's voices and women's participation in the security sector, after a lot of training that's done by of the police force, and in my research, what I've seen, particularly in Afghanistan, is that female police officers also experience a lot of sort of discrimination within the force after you have the international trainers and international police force when they leave. So how to actually change that? So it's again, that just because you include women in a sector where traditionally they have not been represented and you train them, it is not enough. How to actually provide and open up that space. Some of these discussions are really, really relevant. And I can again talk about that a little bit more if you're interested during Q&A. So gender debates then in security is about victimization. We talked about first, it's very much irrelevant, and then it's about victimization, and thinking about inclusion. What does it mean to include women in terms, and how do we actually add their perspective? And how do we think about masculinity, that are men disciplined into gender roles too? If we see them in police force, if we see them in the armed forces, how do we actually think about that, and how do we actually change that in those masculine spaces to enable women to think about a different kind of leadership that is truly inclusive and truly thinking about diverse voices? States in South Asia are very much gendered. State serves as the primary category in the modern understanding of political identity, but it's very much through ideas of citizenship. And these ideas of citizenship from political theory work, we know, often relegates women in the private spaces and private spaces in the household that does not have enough actually obviously household is important in terms of the state and society, but often you see those are spaces which have become very much invisible in terms of important ideas in South Asia. So how to actually think about and empower households and families, and how to actually bring women from those private spaces in public domain is actually not enough if we only sprinkle one or two women in a sea of men. So thinking about that leadership is very much important when we're also looking at state and how gendered states are, and how gendered war and conflicts are. So this is an image of me. You can see it's in a Rohingya camp where I served for quite a long time. So here I'm talking to religious leaders, trying to tell them about child marriage and early marriage. So changing social norms. So bringing men and trying to explain to the men of the community who are the leaders. So it's not only states and it's not only the national movement, but also community leaders trying to tell them how it's important to bring women at the forefront of the leadership. So the advocacy work is also very much important, not only at the state level, not only at the, in the senior leadership level in governments, but also very much on the ground with communities. To think about that, it becomes very, very important. So to sum up, I think so this is some of the way I do my work. Just going back briefly, analyzing gender relations, looking at ways of how states, national movements, and communities utilize or deploy gender in the making of nation. Then thinking about processes that impact on subaltern groups, which include minorities, refugees, women. So linking it always back to theoretical understanding of women and nation, but not only talking about sexual and gender-based violence, but how also women's bodies are marked as territory for communication in terms of nation-building processes, but then how women are part of peace building and community building as well. And how to think about the way we bring women and diverse voices in terms of our discussion in academia, in terms of our practice, and in terms of women's leadership globally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Da Costa. And I'm pretty sure that this presentation just gave us a lot of things to think about. I was particularly curious about that photo that you posted of you in the Rohingya camp.
Oh, yeah.
Would you mind just saying in a minute on how was that experience? You were, and in that situation, you were talking about women, and it looked like you were the only woman in that photo.
That's right. I hope you can see it still here.
Yes.
That's right. I was the only woman in the photo. This was actually in 2017. So 25th of August, the UN, when this massive displacement started, this wave of displacement, the Rohingya, and this was taken around early October, because in 1st of September, the UN announced this as the L3 emergency, which is the highest level of emergency in terms of humanitarian crisis globally. So, which meant that, you know, everybody had to leave everything and had to go and work there. So I was also working there. So it wasn't always easy, but it is also interesting here because, you know, this is about power. Power meaning in a different way, because I was representing the UN. I was coming from a big funding organization. So they are listening to me, are interested. And when I was asking them, so do you understand that girls should not be married off? Because in the Rohingya community, they marry off girls as soon as they reach puberty. Between 9 to 12, almost all girls are married. So we're trying to tell them. And they said, yes, yes, we understand. But then, you know, after that meeting, they handed me an invitation to a wedding of this girl who is 12, and the boy is also 17. So both are children. So, you know, so it is not only actually talking, meaning this is the beginning. So you talk to them and they agree, but that doesn't mean anything in many ways. You really have to then, it's a work that's constant and continuous engagement, and bringing the community, bringing the women, trying to, so it's not only speaking in these spaces, but also actually bringing those kinds of discussions within their households, which is very much private in many ways. So it felt really good, but also have to recognize that I am actually in a different power position here. It's changed. So more than the religious community, all the men sitting in front of me, I am actually representing power there. So this is also important to recognize. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was fantastic. We do have some questions here on the Q&A, but let's hear from our next speaker today, Dr. Nicole Haley, and then our two panelists can address the questions, because I think that it can give us a very good discussion. Dr. Haley, good morning, or good evening here in Brazil, over there in Brazil. I feel like I'm at home. Dr. Haley? Okay, so let's address one of the questions while Dr. Haley maybe have an issue with the camera. Oh. Morning, Doctor.
Yeah, morning, Anna, and good evening to everybody who's listening from Brazil.
Yeah, Dr. Haley has a PhD in anthropology and is currently writing about electropolitics and local political procedures in Papua New Guinea. Is that it, Doctor?
Yes, that's correct.
Mm-hmm. And how different is this experience of women leaders in Papua New Guinea that you've been researching to those in Australia and maybe to other places like in Brazil?
Well, very different to Australia, that's for sure. And that I have to admit, I'm not exactly sure how it compares to the situation in Brazil, but hopefully some of that may come out in the discussion that we have following.
All right, so over to you, Doctor.
Thank you, Anna. So following on from Bina, and I'm going to take a slightly different take on this, and to talk about sort of some of the research and the work that we've been doing in the Department of Pacific Affairs that's been working to understand the barriers to and the enablers of women's leadership in the region, and also what we're doing to support women's leadership in the region in which we work. And I think this is really interesting because in 2017, 18, the school that Bina and I are in, the Coral Bell School, we agreed on sort of 3 strategic goals for the school. And the second of those goals was around the generation of knowledge about the societies and the polities of the Asia and the Pacific. And the third goal was to be the leading institution supporting positive social and political change in the Asia Pacific. And that third goal, I think, is really, really important because it recognizes that, that we don't just study the region, but that we're part of it and that we have an active role to play, not simply as generators or translators of knowledge, but as active researchers using the knowledge that we generate to support positive outcomes in the societies in which we work. And for myself and my colleagues in DPA, that's very much a sort of guiding focus of the work that we do. It speaks to our desire to support local actors to achieve lasting positive social and political change, and to shape sort of regional and country-specific programs and projects and engagement processes. So across the Bell School and certainly in DPA where I work, there are scholars informing practice through evidence-based research and working on a range of fronts to improve the quality of aid engagement, elections and transparency and accountability initiatives, women's political participation and economic empowerment, and working to develop programming to reduce gender-based violence and improve basic service delivery. As Anna said in the introduction, most of my own research over the past 2 decades has been focused on elections and electoral politics. And it has involved working to support electoral integrity in the region, but also women's political participation. And the latter aspect of that has very much been informed by ongoing research that seeks to better understand the nature of women's political participation, their experiences as their experiences of elections, that is as voters and as candidates, and the experiences of women political leaders once elected. So I should at this point acknowledge the Australian government and in particular the aid program for its ongoing support for our work, both through the Pacific Research Program, but also through a multi-year research grant that allowed us to undertake multi-country sort of study of women's leadership and political participation. So a little bit of background about the region for those who are maybe not so familiar with the Pacific and the Western Pacific in particular where we work. So Pacific Islands region is the most culturally and linguistically diverse part of the world. It has over 10 million people and over 1,200 different languages and cultures. Populations throughout the Pacific are predominantly rural and increasingly youthful. In the societies of the Western Pacific, the Melanesian countries, and here we're sort of talking about PNG, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Fiji, leadership is often achieved, and you have very much small kinship-based social units. In Polynesia and Micronesia, other parts of the Pacific, tend to be more hierarchical with inherited rank chiefs, but across the Pacific, gender is a major fault line. In the contemporary context, gender roles are changing and have changed markedly in this short space of time. Ideals of masculinity have been radically transformed over the space of just a couple of generations. And this has given rise to a profound sense of rupture, I think, across generations, and one that's fraught with violence and conflict in many cases. So not just in terms of violence against women, but intergenerational conflict between different generations of men. Across the Pacific, women are grossly underrepresented in Pacific Island legislatures. And although women account for about 1 in 5 elected leaders worldwide, they account for less than 2% of elected leaders in Melanesia. So Papua New Guinea, which has 111 members of parliament, has no women. Similarly, Vanuatu, which has 52 seats in their parliament, has no women. Of the Melanesian countries, the Solomon Islands has three women in parliament. So across Melanesia, the total representation of women is about 1.4%. None of the Melanesian countries have adopted quotas nationally, although subnational representation for women is guaranteed in PNG and in Vanuatu. Efforts to improve women's political participation and women's representation across the Pacific have not delivered the gains that were sought. The slow pace of change in the Pacific is partly because of structural impediments that have proved difficult to overcome, but it's also because development partner responses have not always drawn on the available evidence regarding the factors that contribute to electoral success in the region. So what does our research tell us about the barriers to and enablers of women's political participation? Firstly, throughout in the Pacific, there's no distinct women's vote for which women candidates might appeal in their campaigns. The research that we've done also shows us very clearly that men and women experience and participate in elections differently, that women are often disenfranchised by violence and intimidation, and that they don't participate in elections as equal citizens. Money politics, which is sort of proliferating around the region, is profoundly gendered, so that men receive cash and gifts more often than women, and typically in much larger amounts. In relation to the performance of women candidates, our research has shown that women who perform well in elections tend to be community-based, deeply connected to their electorates, are well educated, recognised as serving the community and delivering benefits to the community. So they talk about having a hand mark, you know, showing what you've done. And women who perform well in elections have support of strong male candidates, they have strong male support within their communities. So our research has also shown something that was quite interesting that we probably didn't necessarily expect to find, and that was that for women who are contesting elections at the national level, unsuccessful candidates who place well, who perform strongly, who run a credible election campaign, many of these women have been able to parlay that into appointed positions or into other sorts of leadership positions at the subnational level. So how does this research help in terms of supporting women's leadership? Myself and my colleagues at DPA have very much sought over the years to ensure that the research that we're doing informs decision-making concerning the nature and design of programs to support women's leadership in the region. And up until quite recently, development partner support for women's leadership in Melanesia has tended to focus on the leadership traits of individual women. So training women candidates based on the experiences of their Western counterparts and supporting advocacy for temporary special measures. The research and analysis that we've done, though, concerning the experiences and the performance of women candidates suggested certainly to us that the approach needed to shift. And so what we've done is really worked at trying to shift the underlying thinking of development partners around their support for women's political leadership in the Pacific. And the research that we've done has indicated, I suppose, some new ways, or some, you know, how we might shift the focus of that support. So that includes providing support throughout the election cycle, given that successful male and female candidates who end up getting elected in the Pacific often have to take a very long-term approach to campaigning, and often have to contest multiple times before winning an election. We've worked at assisting women to develop strategies to mobilise the broad-based support, so appealing to a broader constituency and not just the women's vote, which is what a lot of the past training had focused on. And really trying to engage with the key challenges, and those being sort of money, politics and violence, those things that inhibit women's electoral performance. So I think a lot of the programming that's happened in the past has been silent on those issues, and those things really impact upon women's ability to perform well in electoral contexts. So until programs really start to address those sorts of issues, a lot of the work that's going on is sort of window dressing around the edges. So in 2016, myself and some of my colleagues in DPA drew on the available evidence that we had to develop and design a new program that's funded by the Australian government through the A program, which is the PNG Women in Leadership Support Program. And it's a 5-year program that's being developed, which was developed and is being delivered in partnership with the PNG Integrity of Political Parties and Candidates Commission. And that the program is very much working to build participants' knowledge of the PNG electoral system. And that's both the formal and the informal rules that govern elections in the country. As I said, we very much try to engage with and acknowledge the context in which women are running for election in these countries. We're working with women to support them to map the political landscape of their electorates and to identify the key social and political factors that are likely to influence the electoral context in their specific electorate. And then also trying to work with women and support them to develop strategies focused on their electorates, which will maximise the support by strategically targeting voters, because we realise that women are at a distinct disadvantage in places where money politics is rife, because they just cannot compete on a level playing field. And if anything, over the course of the last few elections in PNG, Solomon Islands, the playing field is becoming less level, so to speak, because elections, there's a lot more money involved in elections and in vote buying and violence and intimidation and things. So in the lead up to the PNG 2017 elections, we trained, we actually sort of thinking of the photo that Bina showed with her talking to communities, we as a group of researchers actually went out and were involved in training women candidates. And we trained 127 women ahead of the the national election. Of those, 47 women went on to contest the elections. And although all of those who undertook the training had initially intended to contest, I think a lot of the women who came along realised that perhaps they weren't quite ready, or that they hadn't done enough of the necessary groundwork. And interestingly, some of those women went on to become campaign managers for other candidates, so they could learn much more about the informal and the formal rules of the game of politics in PNG. Some went on to become election observers. We ran a very large-scale election observation across the country, and some of those women joined the team so that they could get an inside view of the election, so to speak. Notwithstanding the training, none of the women that we actually trained were elected, and that was I suppose very much a disappointing result, both for us and for the country more generally in PNG. But what we did find was that the women who did undertake the training placed higher on average than women candidates who didn't undertake the training. They were 4 times more likely to have placed in the top 5 places, and 6 times more likely to have finished in the top 10% of candidates in their electorates. Something that's really important to understand about PNG politics is that it's very fiercely contested, and each individual seat is contested on average by 30 or so candidates. So it's very intense conflict. So the fact that we've got women finishing in the top 5 or in the top 10% of candidates, top 3 positions, we saw that as a very significant improvement, because historically women have tended to get such a very small percentage of the vote share in elections. We've also, and as I said, many of those women who performed well in the elections and who ran really credible campaigns have moved into appointed positions at the subnational level and at the district level in the districts that they contested in. And that's another aspect of the training that we've tried to bring in, is to expose women to the many different ways that they can be political at the local level, so that they're not just in terms of being elected to national level politics, but there are a range of appointed roles. And sometimes contesting a national election is an important pathway into those roles. And so I think it's another thing that we've been trying to inject into the research and the thinking, is that we know through work on politics and elections with men, there are many different reasons why male candidates contest elections, and it's not necessarily because they want to win, but it's about profile building. There's all sorts of other things. But oftentimes, I think the work that's focused on women's leadership and women in politics has failed to recognise that women too often have multiple reasons for contesting. So we're trying to think about, how do we, are there better ways that we can measure success, and to try and look at, not only the sheer numbers of women that get elected, but what are they trying to achieve through that. And so very much a successful campaign can well be one where somebody finishes in the top few places, but then parlays that into other work at the local level. Beyond this, there's sort of more work as well. So that's certainly very much focused on PNG, that program. But other colleagues in GPA have been involved in both the design and supporting the delivery of a new multi-country program that's working across the Pacific, and that's a balance of power program. And that's working in 3 countries, in Tonga, Vanuatu, and I've forgotten the 3rd country, sorry. Oh, and Fiji. And they're looking at, I suppose, working at a sort of level to try and support changes to social norms and trying to increase the legitimacy of women's political leadership at the local level. And so in Vanuatu, for instance, that work has focused recently on promoting women's leadership as part of the cyclone recovery. So there was a big tropical cyclone in April that caused a lot of devastation across multiple countries. So working to support women to create those spaces for them to exercise leadership in those recovery efforts. And they're also working to design and to develop bespoke, very locally appropriate activities that again support women's leadership at the local level. So they're working with media outlets to try and run more gender sensitive election commentary, and also I suppose working to address some of those barriers around women's participation so that women can participate more equally as citizens in elections and not be locked out of the electoral process. Because in much of, well, certainly in PNG and to some extent in the rest of Melanesia, it's often the case that women don't even get to, you know, to touch their own ballot papers or fill them in. There's so much, you know, pre-marked ballot papers at election time being filled out by small groups of men, etc. So, you know, the work that we're doing across the region, which is informed by the research that we've done, is very much trying to address, you know, those barriers at all sorts of levels to try and support women's leadership and women's political participation in the region. Okay.
And that's a fantastic job, Doctor. And we do have some questions here that I believe relate to that. And I would like to hear from you and also from Professor Da Costa. How we have a question here that talks about specifically about Islamic communities, but I would like to expand it. How receptive are men to the message that including women is essential to national building? And just to give you some idea, in Brazil, in the last few years, the Congress, 10 to 15% of representatives are women. So we are still 90% male representatives in the Brazilian Congress in average in the last few years. So yes, how receptive are men in different communities to this idea that it is essential to have women in national building?
Bina, do you want to go?
Yeah, I was just wondering, Nicole, do you want to answer first, or do you want
Okay,
me?
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
It's quite an interesting area because there's been a number of, through our own election work, and we've done large-scale citizen surveys in the region. And one of the questions that we often ask people is around their willingness to vote for a woman candidate. Interestingly, response rates, positive response rates to those sort of questions are very high. And so at one level, there's an openness and receptiveness to vote for women. Although one of the other things that we've then asked people about is, are there good women contesting the election? And often you get a much lower positive response rate, around 40%. And so, and this is the thing, typically, again, programs that have tried to support or train women candidates in the past have often focused on urban-based, educated, elite women. And oftentimes their skills, experience, etc., doesn't translate into votes in the community, because what communities are looking for is a representative that can deliver services at the local level. And so taking women out of an urban area who have this good education, good jobs, etc., it doesn't translate in the village context. And so one of the things that we're sort of trying to do is reach out to that village level and to identify those candidates or those women that have a hand mark, that have already established performance at the local level, and trying to support those women. So I think it's really interesting. So in principle, yes, people are open to it, but when they look at the field of candidates, they don't necessarily think that there are good women candidates in the field. So what we're trying to do is improve the field, so to speak, and improve it in a sense of what voters are looking for.
Is it maybe related to the idea that that women have to take care of the home, so they have to take care of the local? Is it a traditional view of what they could do in the political spectrum, or is it much deeper than that?
Well, I mean, I think, traditional notions of the role of women is what's kept women out of politics for a very long time. But in terms of what voters are looking for, and in both men and women, is a candidate who can deliver services for them. So people certainly throughout Melanesia vote locally. Service delivery is very much politicised. So, you really need to get your candidate in if you want to guarantee that you will get services for the next 5 years, say. So they are looking to support people who they believe can deliver.
Thank you so much. Professor Da Costa, would you like to comment on that as well? And maybe on this, how optimistic you are that maybe this traditional view will change a bit?
Yes, sure. I'm very happy to respond. And I actually, from South Asian perspective, what Nicole said very aptly in terms of the Pacific is extremely relevant. And that's what we see, a lot of comparison in terms of women's political participation, that in principle, communities who from outside could be seen as traditional, conservative, they are receptive after decades of work and advocacy at various levels, and they understand the importance of including women. But then again, it's very much linked to, that point, what Nicole made is about service delivery, that who can actually offer them the best services, particularly for very vulnerable communities. Now, this is interesting in terms of South Asia, which have been actually, a global hub for a lot of development activities. So very large NGOs have worked here, donors, important donors have worked here, then it had served for decades as, hot zones for conflict. So there was a lot of interest from security sector, and the way they have tried to build states to bring stability is through development work. So the humanitarian development nexus is very much there, you see. And also South Asian elite, you have, many of them have studied in, in the global north. So they've brought back the ideas of political participation, leadership, gender equality with them, but it not very much it had translated at the very much in the rural level, particularly, or at the ground level, for various reasons. The societies, you have that patron-client relationship, the kinship formation, the way the villages actually connect with each other, a lot of those have not been always understood when you were trying to think about how to make women participate. So what happened is that you have in national movements, women were all, out in the street, they fought in the insurgencies as guerrilla soldiers as well. But as soon as there were peace deals, then they were forced to go back to households. So the women who served in combat positions, particularly in a lot of national wars. So at that time they were celebrated and then they were pushed back. So it had happened many times. And same way, when you had big donors like the British DFID, which has now obviously changed very recently, and then the USAID, Australian foreign aid and trade, DFAT also serves a lot in the in South Asia. So they tried to encourage women's political participation, and again included those women who served on the streets as advocates. But a lot of those trainings didn't really include how to have them, how they could sort of like amplify their voices in very traditional negotiations. So they're great on the streets in activism, but then how they are also negotiating, so that it's a different way of negotiating, right? From in the street-based activism, then in very much constrained, measured in different ways, meaning we can also talk about it in gendered ways, that how those spaces operate. So to be a good operator from not only in streets, but also in those high-level platforms, it requires decades of understanding, experience, political savviness, training. So sometimes women are not offered those choices and not given that. So they are simply brought in. So what happens is that the same woman who is an amazing leader on the street is not speaking up when a question about a negotiation, a complex negotiation, is actually placed on the table. It doesn't mean that she doesn't have a voice, but we are not really always understanding the silences and deciphering what the silences mean. So what it means, and I'm like drawing from other questions here, is that in masculine spaces, how to actually learn and unlearn what it means to have diverse voices, what it means to have inclusive voices. That's essential to change as well. Simply bringing women, simply enabling some of them for political participation is not enough. We've seen that everywhere. Over to you, Anna.
Now, continuing on that point, we do have questions here in our Q&A. So how can women from different grounds break that glass ceiling at the workplace, for example? And we do have a question that comes from one of the male participants. How should we men act to promote gender equity? And sometimes they, trying to take women's leadership in promoting gender equity, reinforcing patriarchy. How do we realize that we are doing this? So,
right.
If you could address.
Should I go first, Nicole, very briefly? Just
yes.
Linking, thanks, Nicole. So just linking with my other points. So I was actually also drawing on these questions, but looking at the first two questions from Luciana and Felipe, thank you for your questions. So obviously one thing is that recognizing that spaces are inherently masculine and these are systemic. So it's structure. So women also play a role in those structures. What enable, those spaces, how they're masculine. So also to think in a different way, it requires a long thinking and constant kind of questioning and thinking. So also recognizing intersectionality. So the class, it's not gender when we're linking it with race, class, culture, location, privilege. Some of us who are sitting here that we are well versed into speaking in different languages. These are also about different kinds of privilege. So how they actually inherently change the platforms. So unlearning, learning, and thinking about some of those is important, very important. And as I said, changing the spaces. So it's very important. And here I'll give an example from my personal experience. There are many times I work in spaces which are inherently very masculine and mostly men. So, there's a lot of emotional labor that women, we have to always try to make those spaces as ours. So you'll go there and all the men are huddled together and they're speaking themselves, and then you have to like really make sure that you are also included in the conversations. It happens over and over again from, you know, and women in different levels as well. So men, they could also try to think about those spaces, that not only actually opening the door, but also having that space, how that's welcoming and comfortable. That's something a lot of men who are champions of women's leadership can do. So recognizing that the masculine way of the culture of workplaces, the culture of leadership spaces, that have to change. How we include women, particularly how we include also diverse voices. So empowering doesn't mean just you know, signing guidelines, but thinking about actually the practice, cultural practice is very much important. I'll pass it over to Nicole now. Thanks, Nicole.
Yeah, thank you, Dina. I suppose one of the other things that comes to mind in relation to the questions around some of the work that colleagues here have been doing very much at the local level, and recognizing that throughout the Pacific, where we work very much, you know, small kinship-based societies, really starting to understand, you know, in a sense, even within communities, there are different categories of women, so to speak. So, and some of that allows them different access or differential access to speak publicly. So, you know, often in communities, if you're a landowner or something of the place, that gives you greater accessibility to be able to speak, so that outside women or in-married women often can't speak publicly around issues. One of the other things that is really interesting that's coming through some of the work that we've been doing is, you know, obviously around the importance of, you know, and this is now very much talking about women's leadership at the local level, the importance of supportive husbands and sons that allow women to take on those public sorts of roles as well, you know, and having that sort of public backing. And oftentimes, quite interestingly, having absent sons, so that in the sense that you can, you know, be speaking on behalf of, you know, so that having on behalf of the son, but allows you to speak publicly in the way that women have been able to use that very effectively and very politically at the local level. So, you know, negotiating all of those sort of constraints at the local level, and so recognizing that, you know, not necessarily can every woman lead, you know, in the sense, but working out how you can support those processes that are going on locally.
Thank you so much, Dr. I would like to invite one of our guests, one of our attendees tonight, to share some of her experience. Brazilian researcher Gisela Ferreira. She researched in the QT, and she works with gendered violence between teenage partners. So, Gisela, would you like to join us and speak for 3 minutes about your experience? Just 1 minute to get Gisela connected with us.
Hello.
Hello. Good
Can you hear
morning,
me?
Gisela, or is it good evening? Where are you joining us from?
I'm in Brisbane, so it's good morning.
Good morning. Would you share a little bit of your experience? You've been researching gendered violence between teenage partners, is that right?
Yeah, it's correct. So I'm a qualified lawyer in Brazil, and I moved to Brisbane 4 years ago. And I'm doing my master's by research on this topic at QUT. I also am a scholarship holder. And my research is focused on education programs for preventing teenage intimate partner violence, but I didn't explore the frame of programs directly. I was interested in hear from advocates involved in these education programs. So I went to Brazil last year and I interviewed 14 advocates in the field, and I also conduct policy analysis focused on prevention policies of the country. So this is kind of the frame of my research. I use what I call a Southern feminist framework, which combines the Southern criminology from Professor Carrie Carrington and colleagues, and the Southern theory from Professor Connell with feminist methodologies, because to address gender-based violence, we must understand that this violence is gendered. This is the first step. And I think this is very clear in our legislation, the Maria da Penha law, and in the Human Rights Convention signed by Brazil, despite there are several backlashes in the country at the moment. And it's also very clear in the Australian guidelines, in the Change the Story framework from ANROS and other Australian organizations. So that was my focus during my master's thesis. I'm about to finish. I'm currently working on the final corrections before the submission. And yeah, I'm glad to announce that I also was awarded a PhD scholarship. So once I finish the master's, I will engage in my PhD journey. So I'm very excited with that. And drawing from my master's, in my PhD, I will focus on technology facilitate abuse, targeting the same public, teenage people, because there's a lack of research regarding this age group in Brazil and in Australia as well. So my plan is to do a comparative study because I am Brazilian, but I'm living here. And I feel this is important. So this is a bit of the background of my research. I'm glad to answer any questions that you might have. I also have a book chapter in press discussing technology facilitate abuse among youth cohorts. And it's going to be open access, which is great. So hopefully I can share this publication with everyone soon. And about my experiences, let's say what else I have done. So I went last year to Brazil, not only to conduct my interviews, but I also attend an amazing exchange program. I think it was called Cooperation Brazil-Australia for Preventing Gendered Violence. It was organized by Monash University in partnership with the Australian Embassy in Brazil, the United Nations, among other Brazilian governments and legal bodies. I think the prosecutor's office, the Ministério Público for us in Brazil, and so on. So we spent a very amazing and busy week between Brasilia and São Paulo. We visit the major and specialized services to respond and prevent violence against women in the country, including the Women's Police Station, and so on. And this was the first stage of this exchange program. This occurred in June last year. And before and after, I was traveling around the country to conduct my interviews. So I went to the Northeast as well and to other states. And in
just very briefly, Gisela, with the target, with the population you are targeting, what do you see being the main differences between the approach to that type of problem in Brazil and in Australia?
Well, at the moment, there's not much research in both countries, because here in Australia, we've been talking a lot about respectful relationships. This is the education program run by the government, particularly in Victoria and now in Queensland. Not now, probably a few years ago, it was implemented in Queensland as well. And in Brazil, the law says that programs should be implemented and working with children and young people in schools, but there's a lot of resistance to do it, despite it's very clear what we have to do. And The first study in Brazil I found focused on what they call dating violence in North America, which will be what I call teenage intimate partner violence. It's dated 2010, so it's quite old. So that's why I decided to focus in this age group, and also because we don't talk about this group as like, I feel people sometimes treat them just like kids, and they don't see the gender features of the violence. And this is happening. There's a lot of controlling behaviors happening. And as women, our adult women, do not perceive themselves in a violent relationship, this is even worse for young people. So this is a big problem. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, we are having cases that ended up very badly. If you've been following the news 2 weeks ago, unfortunately, 18-year-old girl was murdered by her 20-year-old partner. So this is serious, and this must be the focus of research.
Definitely. Because we have three academics here, 3 women doing research in that, we do have a question about academia. How can we change the women inclusion in academia? And the person who asked the question mentions maternity leave as one of the factors that influence it, but what are other factors that affect women in academia, and how can it be a more inclusive environment? Would you consider it an inclusive environment these days?
Maybe Nicole can answer it first, and then we can follow.
Sure. Although Bina can probably talk to all the good work she's been doing in the school and the college in our university to do that. But I think, yes, you know, the impact of, you know, maternity leave and caring responsibilities, etc., you know, is certainly very much acknowledged. And certainly, you know, within our university, and I think more broadly, you know, they do try now to, you know, assess individual performance relative to opportunity. That's not always done particularly well, but certainly in the area that I work, and I just give an example, like when I joined the department that I'm in, there was like 5 men and I was the only woman. And now it's very much changed, and we have about equal numbers of men and women. But to get to that point, you know, we really had to focus on around you know, selection committees and appointments, of really trying to ensure that, you know, my colleagues and people on selection panels take that very seriously, that sort of looking at performance relative to opportunity. And I think, you know, for in my experience, a really critical part of that equation is actually at the shortlisting stage. And so making sure that women, you know, get the opportunity to have the interview and things, you know, because often they perform really well and at the interview, but, you know, if you exclude them at the shortlisting stage because they don't have as many publications or something, it makes it incredibly difficult. I also just want to mention a piece of research that we're just starting, and that's and hopefully it's going to involve colleagues in our own school, where Bina and I work, but also across 3 Pacific institutions. And we actually want to look at the effect of COVID-19 on women's work and women's careers in the context of that. So I'm sure other people have experienced this, but we've certainly been on lockdown for many months, working from home, trying to work from home and juggle caring and homeschooling and all sorts of things. And those are certainly the issues we've been dealing with. Our sense is that for our Pacific colleagues, there are even additional burdens, because, you know, Pacific Island countries haven't been able to have the same, I suppose, sort of economic stimulus packages, the same sort of support for people in their communities. And so often for women that are working in paid work, they're supporting you know, large numbers of extended family, etc. And so we want to try and understand the dynamics of that in the context of something like COVID, where there have been a lot of restrictions. And thankfully, the Pacific has you know, escaped the worst of it so far. There's very few infections in the Pacific because they acted very quickly to impose really strict quarantine measures and lots of sort of social restrictions. But those restrictions too are impacting on people, you know, there's certainly, and we think that I suppose the way those restrictions are experienced is very gendered as well. And so that's something we're looking to try and explore across 4 countries.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to comment as well, Professor Da Costa?
Sure, Anna. So very briefly, I think we need to really unpack what we mean by inclusion. We need to think about diversity, and also, you know, what we mean by women in many ways, right? Because women are also not homogeneous as a category. There are so many different kinds of women. So in terms of academia, I think one important thing to really, I've been talking a lot about opening up the space, and I think this is something in academia we have to do very consciously in different disciplines through our citation practices, you know, bringing in voices of that we don't actually also serve as gatekeepers. So we bring in diverse voices of women. We bring diverse voices that talk about women's and men's rights and equality. So that's very important to think about. So through citation, actually making women's presence visible and legitimate within this space in academia. Because at the end, you know, as academics, the more and more we cite other research and stuff, that's how our voices amplify in many ways. So that's one way to think about it in terms of research, how we bring different kinds of voices. So I had a PhD student she was from Mexico, and she was looking at the commissions in Peru and Guatemala, the truth commissions, and looking at issues of disappearance and also children who were born out of sexual violence. So I learned so much from her because I was encouraging her that, look, don't bring me the traditional IR work that I already know. Don't even cite me. Bring me something from the region in the languages and that I can learn from. And she did that. It was absolutely amazing to learn from her how she brought those kinds of literature and voices, which, you know, she spoke Portuguese and she spoke Spanish. So it was very easy for her, and French. So she was bringing all this literature. I learned so much. And I think that's how to actually also learn from younger generation, that not only offered them the kind of space that academia has to open up, but also bringing young, diverse voices, champion, and asking them to bring different kinds of literature and practices for us to learn. I think it's very, very important. Policy-wise, at the university, I do that work, and I have to tell you, and many of you would know from your own experiences, it's not easy. It's not easy because you have indicators, you have measures, we can sometimes do tick, tick, tick in terms of training. Those are easier things. But then to make deeper changes, it is a lot, there's a lot of emotional labor, there's a lot of different kinds of labor, and you can't say no. Many times, you know, if I know that if I say no, there's no one else who's going to go and talk in some places. So trying to link policy and practice is something that we are trying to do at the ANU, to think about equitable work distribution and trying to bring some of those voices. So there's a lot of work that's to be done. So we are hoping to do that in many different ways. And I must say at the ANU, at least there's that acknowledgement. We are also trying to bring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices. And sometimes they say, we are so few, but we're exhausted. We are always called to do all this work. So trying to also think about equitable distribution in academia. But at the end, the point is that what do we mean? What should we have? What should a 21st century university look like? And it has to really have that kind of space where we are, there together, men and women, and those from who don't also transgendered people. Actually, how do we actually bring all those different voices is very important.
Definitely, and it's refreshing to hear it. Just a bit conscious of time, so just go through the last question in our Q&A here. I would just like to expand it a bit. The person is asking actually about security and conflict that you were mentioning before. What would you say is the impact of gendered national service, Professor Da Costa? For example, in Singapore, that only males have to serve, or in Israel, both male and female serve.
Yep.
And just maybe to finalize, when you see other institutions that are 100% male or maybe 100% female, how do you change that?
Right, thank you for this question. It's a very important question, and I didn't really mention, and it's probably not in my bio, that I worked with the UN Department of Peacekeeping Operations, DPKO, previously, and I have done a lot of work with the security sector in different countries, particularly those countries who contribute forces to peacekeeping. So I can, just like from my experience, what I can say is that, you have these military organizations, they have a long history of male domination. And not only symbolically, but also numerically. So what you have at the beginning of 2001, beginning of the millennium, we had 6 out of 200 countries that had a share of women which is larger than 5% in their armed forces. So you have women who were traditionally working as secretaries, and they're doing nursing within the military, and you had the soldiers who were obviously the traditional, the archetypical kind of symbol of masculinity in this in military organizations. And you have those combat units, of course, and there's not a lot of women who were participating. It has changed. In 2018, for example, Sweden has changed it, following Norway and Finland, but still there's not a lot of women there. And you have IDF, which you mentioned, the Israeli force. So IDF is the only army in the Western world, we know, that where you have women who are drafted to military service by law. So they serve in the army. They've been serving since its establishment in 48, but they originally, at that time, they were actually not serving in combat positions in IDF either. They were serving in administrative jobs, then they were serving as instructors in various kinds of fields, and they have gradually moved to military service within IDF. And you actually have, this is a recent, there's a national service ordinance, I think, and I'm sorry, I can't remember it very clearly at this moment, but you have this traditional religious orthodoxy in Israel, which is very much against women's combat role, active combat role within the system. So there's a lot of internal debate within Israel. So just because they are participating, it doesn't mean that gender equality questions are not there. Now, in terms of Singapore, what you have is that obviously the male-only policy, it is a constant debate, but from various levels. You have this 2 years mandatory conscription, but sometimes men actually argue in Singapore that because of that, they're a bit behind in the social workforce, because the pay is not that high. So in Singapore, which is a highly developed economic, meaning the salary level is quite high. So they sometimes think they're a little bit behind than women, because they start 2 years later. So you have that question. But then again, if you have women in other masculine spaces talking about issues which relate to national security, often the male leader in Singapore say, no, you haven't served in the military, so you can't really say. So it has both ways. It's a bit complex in terms of Singapore. Not serving has its advantage, but serving creates a different kind of legitimacy. So labor force participation, and in this workforce thing in women, women's participation in Singapore is a bit complex. So I think at the end, obviously, national service, that was the question, it's gone from here. But I guess it's an important kind of leveler in terms of security discourses, but it's not also without its own complexity there. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you. And well, it is 11 a.m. in Australia now, and so 10 p.m. in Brazil. Thank you so much for being with us all this time. And I hope you enjoyed tonight's presentations as much as I did in the entire series. We could keep talking about those issues for hours here because each topic has just so much to be discussed about. I would just like to thank our guests, Dr. Haley, Professor Da Costa. Thank you so much for being here. I would also like you to introduce you to Daniel Brown and to Elena Alves from the International Strategy and Partnerships Division here at the ANU that have organized and have been supporting this entire series. I would like to have a round of applause for them, even if it's a virtual applause. They did a fantastic job organizing those 6 webinars with fantastic people like Dr. Haley and Dr. Da Costa. Every day was an incredible experience. Would you like to say a few words, Daniel, Elena?
Yes, first of all, I'd like to thank Gisela coming to us all the way from QUT in Brisbane. In fact, QUT, I worked there for about 7 years, and the first trips that I took to Brazil were when I was working for QUT. So it's got very fun memories. So thank you. Professor Da Costa and Dr. Haley, thank you so much for giving us this wonderful finale to our seminar series. Anna Paula, you are amazing as a moderator, and I think there's a career for you in TV in the near future if you ever leave us at ANU. Thanks everybody who has joined us, all of the Brazilian alumni over the past 2 weeks. And also, I just wanted to have a very, very special thank you to Helena, who has worked so hard to bring this series to everybody in Brazil and around the world that's been tuning in. So thank you so much, Helena. Would you like to say something?
It has been a pleasure to work in the background for the delivery of this seminar series. I hope all have enjoyed as much as we did, and we'll continue collaborating for the enhancement of the university's collaboration with Brazil and Latin America. And thank you also to the Australian Embassy in Brazil.
Definitely, as an alumni myself whose life changed because of this opportunity to study in Australia, I would really like to highlight the importance of initiatives like this that the Australian Embassy and the ANU brought to all of us. Thank you so much. If you have any inquiries about the relationship of the university in Brazil, about the university, or to contact our speakers, we do have contacts in the chat. Thank you, Australian Embassy. Thank you to all the Brazilian alumni that joined us for the last 2 weeks in this incredible journey. Abraço grande a todos e a gente se vê logo. Boa noite a todos e tchau, tchau.